Open Market is sponsored by AdLib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With AdLib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com today.
Welcome to Open Market, a podcast about building companies in the advertising industry. I'm Joe Zappa, and I'm joined by Eric Franchi and Mike Cassidy, the CEO of M3. Welcome, guys.
Hey, Joe. How you doing?
I'm great. Mike, thanks so much for joining us. Where do we find you?
Nice to meet you, Joe, and Eric. Good to spend time with you as always. I'm a Floridian these days, but spending a couple weeks in New York City. So most people leave Manhattan for the summer, and I've come up for the summer, but it's been great.
Okay, weird choice, but different strokes for different blokes.
So this week we're going to talk about the story of Undertone, and we can't tell the story without Mike. Joe, I know what you're thinking, which is Mike has all the dirt on Eric Franchi, given that we worked together for, I don't know, like 15 years side by side. Mike is impenetrable. So you know that meme of Ben Affleck in the movie The Town, where he like goes to his friend and he's like, I need you to do something. I can't tell you what we're doing. You can't talk about it afterwards. And some people might get hurt. And then the friend pauses and says, whose car are we going to take? That's Mike.
Yeah.
So don't even try it. He's locked down.
All right. I won't try to get Mike to tell us stories about you drunk downtown in your 20s.
Never happened.
It sounds like you already know the stories, Joe. I don't know what more.
Okay, before we get to the founding of the company, I was just curious to learn a bit more about your background. So, did you guys know any entrepreneurs growing up? What did your parents do?
Yeah, so my mom, she had receptionist jobs, temporary jobs, but mainly at home. I learned a lot from my dad, from how to work in a small company and be at a small company. He had one job. He graduated high school, joined a company that sold airplane parts, worked for the founder, the person who started it, and was there for 47 years. And so I spent a lot of summers at his office, and so got to see firsthand how my dad could be that squeaky wheel and, give feedback that maybe others weren't confident enough to give, and, how you try to hold people accountable but have fun at work. So I also saw his boss, the person he worked for, and how he carried himself, and how he had the Cadillac, which was like kind of the symbol of I've made it in America, and how he would work hard and had nice suits. And yeah, there was probably a little bit of learning from him of what to do, seeing how he treated people, and just getting that exposure. So early on, that was probably the most influence I had to business and entrepreneurship.
Both my parents were school teachers, and my dad was forced to retire due to disability. So he was a forced entrepreneur. He got into real estate, residential real estate. So I had I think I had an early inkling of the entrepreneurship path from observing him, but now no real, kind of 0 to 1 entrepreneurship that I observed. And frankly, back then, it wasn't the cool path, the cool career path that it is right now. Like it was rare. You went to school and you wanted to become like an investment banker or a management consultant or something like that. This wasn't, necessarily the path, at least for us back in that generation.
Yeah, I was thinking that because you guys came into the labor market in around the early 2000s.
Late 90s.
Okay, I was trying to help, but sure. So yeah, definitely good times for investment banking still. But I think even nowadays, that's the fastest path to just like making money. If you want to do that, is like going into a service industry like law or investment banking or whatever. So I think entrepreneurship requires obviously a heavier appetite for risk and a willingness to undergo years of potentially not making it. Though I think in Undertone's case, things actually took off pretty quickly. But maybe, Mike, there's the steadfastness with your dad of working the same job for, over 40 years. You have a bit more appreciation for that day in, day out work that is ultimately leading to something versus like a very glamorous investment banking type job where, you're trying to make a ton of money young.
Yeah, no, I agree. When we started the company and got it going, or at the outset of thinking of it, I remember sharing it with my parents, and the first reaction was, "Don't do it," right? Because their experience was, being somewhere, being loyal. I started when I began working at About.com, where Eric and I spent time together. I ended up leaving the company after 2.5, 3 years. But I remember at points loving it so much, thinking I would be here for 40 years. I literally had that concept in my mind. And lo and behold, it was far from that. So I think we're shaped by our experiences, meaning sometimes we follow that direction and sometimes we go in the opposite direction. And luckily in this case, it can work great, right? You can be at a place for a long time and have a successful career. And you can also, hopefully bounce forward or make smart moves and have tenure, that's a little bit less, which clearly is more the norm today than it would have been in, prior generations.
What were you guys doing at about.com? Was that ad sales?
We were salespeople. Mike was there for about a year before me. He was the top salesperson. So I wanted to get to know him, get to become friends with him, follow in his footsteps, maybe learn some stuff from him. So we started, just kind of hanging out and became friends and colleagues from day one.
What did you learn about sales at About, and what did you learn about the advertising industry?
So About.com was great from the standpoint of the first person who hired me came from the media world. He was one of the senior salespeople at Life magazine, and he was your classic go to Smith & Wollensky a couple of days a week, shake hands, everybody knows you. So that was completely foreign to me. And just seeing what it was like to entertain and build relationships. So there was that component of About.com where they were trying to teach us directly or indirectly the dynamics of media sales. But then you had this whole new frontier of digital, which wasn't traditional media sales, although there were elements of it. So then you get this other crop of people that are influencing you on how do you sell in a different way, right? That's more tech-led, that's more product-led, that's a little bit more performance-led, even if it's a brand solution, because it's the internet, there's still a performance component. So I think About taught us those things, again, directly and indirectly, and then just being in a growth environment, right? When you're the 80th employee or the 60th employee, whatever number it is, a short bit of time, you're 400 or 500 people, you change your company name, you're private, you're public, osmosis, just by being there, you just get a lot of exposure and just see a lot of things.
I think that makes sense. For me, it's probably, more of the same, where it was the base of customers for About, similar to, I think, the modern day ad tech companies, was a lot of agencies. So just like understanding how agencies work, understanding the relationship sell, understanding like the ins and outs of like the RFP cycle, I think was important, very foundational for us for what led to it. It was the beginning of the internet. So everybody was learning this stuff at the same time. So if you were, I think, smart and savvy, you were able to, be creative, structure deals, figure stuff out. And then, it was a very entrepreneurial culture. It was a very entrepreneurial time. You were able to, try some things and see if they worked.
Yeah, it makes sense that would have been a great time to be getting into advertising with obviously the rapid growth of digital. Did you feel like there was a generational gap at the time where as people in their early to mid 20s, it was easy for you to adapt to the change, and that have anything to do with the desire to start your own company?
Yeah, I mean, the timing couldn't have been better as far as a market, if you will. I had in college, I had a lot of summer jobs working at companies that were predecessors to Verizon and other businesses like that. And I remember working in different departments in an admin or support role. And, I'm faxing documents, right? I'm doing things like that. I'm doing what was the technology of the day. And then very quickly fast forward, and I'm working a few years later, and there's not a lot of faxing. There's a little bit, but email starts to become much more dominant. And so the people that grew up with faxing as an example, and faxing, don't take it so literally, but it's a way of working, right? It's a tool, and a pretty important tool. And so you orient and you learn on that sort of tool. And it's an indicator of kind of where we are technically at the time. And so people are working a certain way. They're used to just phone calls. If you need to get something done, you fax, you pick up the phone, or you send a letter. And then the internet advances, and then you start sending emails. And so Eric and I grew up getting comfortable sending emails because we were one of the first generations to send email. So think about our ability to communicate quickly and decisively and be responsive, where it was an advantage to us as being early salespeople versus when a company like About.com would hire your traditional media person who knew media and knew advertising, but was honestly kind of tripping over themselves on when to send an email, how to send an email. And that email would look more like a letter than it would like an email. And then you would just see some of those people, while they were clearly very capable, knowledgeable, would in some cases struggle and not adapt to the culture and not adapt to the culture of the company, but also not adapt to the culture of the customer. Because a lot of the customer matched Eric and me as far as who we were profile wise and where we were in our kind of life and professional journey, and not so much that other person that came in. And that's a lesson that I've learned, right? When you hire, you need to hire across the spectrum, but also recognize, those experiences are going to drive how you act, how you perform, and your relatability, which is so important in media.
And at the time, like the internet, in terms of like advertising, was still very small. Like print was still dominant. Obviously, TV was still dominant, and it was looked at as like a stepchild, as a little brother, little sister. So you really wanted to be in it, and a lot of people didn't believe. So again, if you had that belief and you can adapt and you could be sort of kind of internet natives, you could go on to do some really good stuff, because a lot of people were going the other way and thought it was a fad.
Whenever you start a company, you have to be going against the grain in some way, right? So was this part of the start of Undertone, as being at about and seeing the digital revolution coming and thinking, hey, maybe we could, help out in this way where people might be being underserved at present?
Yeah, like I think back when I was in college and leaving and thinking about a job, and the only two things I was really focused on was, one, I wanted a sales job because I thought that would fit my skills. And I was very financially motivated at the time, right? I wanted a better life for myself and saw how hard my parents worked and wanted to just have more resources. So that was piece one. And the second was, I just thought this internet thing could be something. And I didn't know enough of what it would be. And I didn't know within which segments would be the right ones. But it was just trying to find that sort of combination. And so, as Eric described, the ad market was starting to grow a little bit with companies like Yahoo and GeoCities and Alta Vista and many others that frankly aren't around anymore. And then there was a point in time before this dot-com bust that you'll hear about and other descriptions like that, where there was this period of time where there was energy around testing and trying and some budgets coming in. But then in 2000, 2001, there became this real hesitation. And it almost flipped, and it almost became what was, for a brief moment, it was kind of easy to sell digital advertising because there was a lot of demand for it. And then, like almost like a light switch for Eric and I and others across the industry, it became very hard to sell digital media because nobody was buying. So it didn't matter how good you were, what your product was, or your fancy email, or the wonderful lunch you maybe took them to, they were not buying. And I think that led Eric and I to recognize, well, you know what? Maybe if it's hard to be a seller and it's easier to be a buyer, perhaps we better flip our hats backwards and let's switch what we do. And that was ultimately the thesis, the big idea, as much of a big idea as we could have at that point in our lives, that really drove us to start the company.
So picture it. March 2000, .com bust begins. NASDAQ peaks and begins like a horrible protracted crash. All of the high flyers of the day either become very small businesses or go out of business. If you're a seller, you might be calling your customer and that customer went out of business and they owe you money. Like this was a very bad time. About, which was a high flying public company, itself went through its own challenges. It was acquired by this like diversified print company called Prime Media. And we're kids just like watching this stuff, trying to figure it out. I think Mike said it quite well. He always had like, I think a very, both an entrepreneurial bent and an eye for opportunity, and, started talking to his largest clients at About and basically asked them like, hey, if you need more help, like buying media more effectively, would you work with us? Could we help you? And that was the birth of the first business. And the first business wasn't Undertone. The first business was an ad agency. It was called Intercept Interactive. And it was basically, the idea was, scrappy internet natives be able to capitalize on what was a very interesting dislocation in the market, which was this, massive lack of demand because, again, companies were going out of business. They were retreating from the internet. Like the economy was not in a great place, which led to, incredible market if you were a buyer and knew what you were doing with internet marketing. So, again, so much of like the Undertone story is like, it makes sense in retrospect, but at the time it was like very contrarian. Like leaving what was at the time a relatively stable job in a known company to start a business when things were crumbling around you imagine the conversations I had with my parents. Like it was, everybody was, I think, very concerned. But again, I give Mike a ton of credit. He saw like this was the opportunity. I think of, at the time we were 25, young lifetimes, but a lifetime.
No, it makes perfect sense that you saw the opportunity with digital, and then also because of the recession, demand is receding. So you can say to brands, like, not only can we help you navigate digital, which is a story that makes sense with the context of the founders and being young and all of that, but also we can help you get ads for cheap because everyone else is running away from this space.
Yeah, I mean, I look back and in some ways we were more stockbrokers, more in financial services than we were in media or advertising. So our pitch was pretty simple, calling brands at the time .com. So orbits.com, apartments.com, match.com, and basically pitching to them, I've got something for you that I think will make you money and will help you. Almost the equivalent, Joe, of me calling you and saying, hey, Joe, I think you should buy IBM, or I think you should buy Johnson & Johnson, or I think you should buy shares of fill in the blank. And in some ways, that's effectively what we were doing in a B2B sort of way, and trying to come to them with, hey, I think we can get you on these websites because we know how to get you on in a better way, a cheaper way. And that's really what it was. It wasn't overly complicated. And then I think the other thing, which was really helpful to us, and I encourage people to do, to be thinking about when they have entrepreneurship on their mind, is take advantage of difficult markets. Right? It's just a great time to get going, and also take advantage, especially to those of you that listen that are younger. There's something about starting it when you don't have the commitments that you might have later on in life. And I think the discussion I'm sure Eric had with his parents, I know I certainly had with mine, was the only risk I literally saw was not doing it, because being just responsible for myself and being young and feeling like I developed a little bit of a skill set in digital media, felt like if it didn't work, I'd go get a job somewhere else. And so it was like this point in time where I could take a chance, where I give a lot of credit to those who are later in life, who have more responsibilities and leave an established job and have to put kids through college or whatever it might be. For us, we could take that chance, and obviously it worked out to be a good decision.
The other thing I would overlay is starting when you don't have a lot of responsibility, starting in what could be difficult markets, but then also leveraging, unique expertise, unique knowledge, right? Like just having digital advertising knowledge at the time was quite rare, right? We were able to bring something to the market that not a lot of people were doing. And there's always that analog, like there's always the new thing. There's always some unique knowledge that you can probably build a business around. That's pretty timeless. So that was the start of the company. It was an agency. It was a pretty simple model that then led to, kind of V2, which was Undertone.
How was standing up a business different 20 years ago to how it is today? I mean, I started a PR and content marketing agency for adtech companies. Nowadays, that's like, it feels very straightforward, right? Because everything's digital. So it's not like you don't need an office. You really don't need any capital to start out. You just need to be able to perform a service that's valuable to people and know how to sell it. And you can start getting some money in the bank and go from there. What was that like when you guys started your agency?
I mean, somewhat similar, but I think the biggest difference between 2024 and 2001 is there's so much more knowledge out there right now. Like there's so many more people that have done this and have done this in public, and there's playbooks on how to start a business and what to do. Back then, it was a lot of like learning as you went along, which could be like a benefit, right? You don't necessarily need to kind of read a playbook and try to apply it to you. So, I think the spirit of just get started applies in every market, but it was harder to find information and expertise. And again, the economy was in a bad place. Venture funds were closing up shop. Forget about trying to raise money for anything internet related. It was a really bad time, which again forced us to be focused on revenue and profits from day one.
And so where did you get with that agency model? Like, getting some of your first customers, maybe approximately, where'd you get from like a revenue or team standpoint before you switched to Undertone and the ad network model?
Yeah, I'm guessing we were probably about 3 million in revenue with a pretty healthy, profit clip. And then staff wise, we were probably 6 or so people, 6 or 8 max. So it was a great lifestyle business. It was a very profitable business for us. When I look back, and the reason we made the change, there was a couple of drivers. One is as an agency, one of the logical questions you get from a client or perspective, a prospect is, well, what's your commission? What's your fee? And so it felt like we were always dealing with, all right, if you make 15%, which was at the time was just like, that's what an agency made. Let's do it at 12% or 13 or whatever it is. So I felt like there was this constant nipping at basically our profit driver, which was our commission. That was number one. And then number two, I know I had confidence issues with, and it was probably real at the time and maybe a little self-imposed, of going to much more senior people in their career and say, I want to be your agent or your advisor. And, I'm 26. And it just felt like we didn't have the credibility to be as effective in a pitch. But all that taught us was it gave us the foundation then to make this pivot and this transition. And so ultimately, Undertone became really just a spin on a model. And you look at so many businesses and how they start and how they take a spin on their model. And sometimes they go in a completely different direction. But a lot of times I think the thesis is right. It's just how you attack it may have to adjust. And that was the same for us, how we had to attack it to adjust for a few reasons. One, to win. Two, to be more profitable. And three, to scale. And I think we were much more effective selling a product. And Undertone became a product. Undertone was a product that had a services component, as any company does, as any product does, whether it's a SaaS business or not. There's some service level. And we had a big service level, just the nature of our market. But going from selling a service and buying the people to buying the product that we sell it was a total game changer.
Yeah. Increasingly, when we were buying on behalf of those clients, we were spending a lot of our budget on ad networks. It was a very efficient way to, get scale. It was a very easy way to drive performance. So we started, I think, Mike is like looking at the business and a lot of the, sort of kind of things that he mentioned. And then you start to see like where the spend is going, not just with us, but I think just like broadly speaking, this was clearly the next wave. I think put us back into our comfort zone of, to his point, having a product, selling a product, so on and so forth. So Undertone V1 was like a one-trick pony. There was this new ad format, and I've told this story before, so I'll try to be concise, that was working very, very well for us. It was called a pop under. So imagine no tabbed browsing. Imagine you basically have a browser, you close it down, and then you see like whatever, your Word doc or something like that. When you close it down, a new mini browser would launch. It would be 720 by 300. And it was basically a digital billboard. It was, for a split second, you had the attention of the user. And it was a big ad, and it can be designed for early interactivity and everything like that. It worked really, really well for our clients. So basically the idea was, hey, can we build a business around this one thing, take it to market and, basically build a network or a marketplace around this one idea. And it just took off from there. I mean, this was like lightning in a bottle, and it started to scale very, very fast.
So, you're running an agency, you have this format you develop. How do you go about shifting from, hey, I'm selling you the service of, buying digital for you, to I'm selling this product, and what were sort of like the growing pains involved there?
The customer changed. So we went from having direct relationships with Orbitz and Match.com and Apartments.com and say, we want to be your advisor, to selling them a product of which they may or may not buy it. But then more importantly, it opened up what we had done professionally, individually ourselves prior, the whole agency world. So we started an agency sales team. And so it was the beginning of hiring salespeople and the beginning of going to the agencies and building a brand, the Undertone brand, and then building out credibility and building out case studies and marketing material, all things that you spend a lot of time, Joe, right, working on and advising on. It was building our go-to-market. Our go-to-market was generally, we thought this was an agency sell. And so that was a shift from what we had been doing for the prior 18 months, give or take. So that was the big transition. And fortunately, we had done that prior. We took a little bit of a break from it, but we had learned how to go to an agency and how to map out this one's part of this holding company. It's gotten more complicated now because you have all the programmatic and you have this group and that group, but it was still complicated enough where you had to map out, who's in San Francisco and who's in Chicago. This General Motors is planning here and buying there. And that's effectively where we had to start to shift and spend more of our time.
Also, we knew the market quite well, and we knew where to get the inventory. This was, maybe a financial services or like a real estate firm, just disguised as an ad sales vehicle. So, we would just go to market and talk about this product, and almost sell ahead of our ability to, kind of have the supply, because we knew where we can get it. which again, I think put us in a position where we were very, very comfortable. We were comfortable like talking to the market. We were comfortable like being on the sales side. So we started to develop this, I think, very aggressive sales approach, very market facing sales approach, which became the DNA of the company as it scaled over time. So we were just out there evangelizing and selling this new format and all the benefits of it to anyone and everyone we could talk to. And again, it scaled from there until it didn't.
Okay, well, we obviously need to get into why it didn't. Great segue, but I'm also going to mess it up a little bit because I am just curious. Agencies versus brands. So it sounds like ultimately you found that agencies were maybe easier to sell to. Would you say that? Like, how did selling to brands differ from selling to agencies? And how do you think what it was like then compares to how it's like now?
Yeah, I think agency selling has a lot of positives to it. The first is typically they're appointed by the brand to do this job. And so if you're fighting the current, you're going to have a hard time. And so I think, quickly embraced that agencies control the market. There's a reason why there's large public holding companies like the WPPs and the publicists and the so on and so forth. And so, they've gone through waves of maybe they're a little more dominant or slightly less, but they're still like so critical to the whole ecosystem. And that really hasn't changed. And so being on the radar of a brand, influencing a brand, hoping you have an opportunity to tell your story to a brand makes a ton of sense. But I think then, and I even lean into it now, be a partner to the agencies. And if you can do well with one account, one of the benefits is they may have another 12 accounts. And so I think agency selling, a lot of our competitors and others tried to, and some companies that started and frankly failed, they got this wrong. They almost said, we're not going to work with the agencies. We think they're an intermediary that gets in the way, or in some cases, we think we're above them. We think our story is such a good story. Our product is so incredible and so wonderful. The brands have to buy it. And lo and behold, they died because they fought the current. And I don't think that was a fight you needed to pick, and a one that in many cases you would lose.
I think there's a lot of wisdom there. I mean, even when you work with SSPs, like to get an SSP off the ground, you obviously need inventory. So like the first task is building relationships with publishers. But once you have those relationships locked in and you sort of have the inventory you need, it becomes a question of wooing the agencies because they're the people who pull the levers, right? So they continue to sort of set the tone for the industry. And there's also something to consider with what you said earlier about like who's at those agencies and who is pulling those levers. You need to speak to people at multiple levels of the organization, but you do, as part of that, need to speak to like the 25-year-old programmatic trader, right? So that's something I find ad tech companies are thinking about a lot. But Eric, you were talking about, so you shift from the agency to the ad network model. It's going well. You have this great format, but it doesn't scale. Why doesn't it scale?
It scales. I mean, there was a few years, right? So we probably started the network business in 2002, and then we probably had like 2 or 3 years of like crazy growth. And this is so long ago that I don't remember the numbers, but it turned into like a really good business. Remember, this was based on this one format that we sort of kind of let in innovation around and really helped to pioneer and scale. It was a pop under, right? It was a browser. And Joe, this predates you, but these became so effective, so widely utilized. They became the scourge of the internet, where you can like go back and there's like Dave Chappelle skits talking about all these pop-ups every time I sign on to the internet. It became pretty bad. So understandably, during a time where, like publishers were desperate for revenue, they would take advantage of this. So there were just like ads popping up all over the place. Well, what started was like this great kind of innovative format quickly turned. So the dominant walled gardens of the day, which were names like Yahoo and AOL, a lot of them were developing these like toolbars to get kind of stickier within the browser, and the browser was typically owned by Microsoft Internet Explorer, and these toolbars started having pop-up blockers embedded into them. So we started to see a decline in the supply as a result. And then maybe a year or so later, Microsoft started shipping its latest actual browser, the version of Internet Explorer, with a pop-up blocker embedded. This thing, we saw, after a while, like it was going to have an ending because, again, the sort of the intermediaries that controlled the internet at the time, they were stepping in. So it forced us to think about like what would be next. How could we evolve and scale the business from there?
So how did you do it? I mean, so I imagine you had to build a business that was more robust than a single ad format. And so what were the long-term growth enablers?
Yeah, I think when we started, as Eric described, with this product, we looked at it as we were just selling a product. And I think when we were at this kind of fork in the road, or maybe dead end, might be a better way to describe it. I think we started to step back and realize, well, this product was effective because it was solving a problem. And we try to understand, well, what problem was it solving and who was it solving a problem for? And then we realized a lot of our customers at the time, not intentionally, we didn't have like a plan that we wanted to go after them. But we just happened to realize like actually most of our customers were, Fortune 500 brands within these agencies. So it was travel companies, it was auto, it was entertainment. I mean, we would work with HBO, we would work with British Airways, we would work with General Motors. So we had all these big clients that were buying this product, and these were the biggest ad spenders. So we realized we built relationships with these companies. We'd understand directly and or through the agency. We'd learned how to sell to an agency, which is an art and a science and a certain skill set that takes time to develop, and better understood the pain points as an agency supporting a client and as a client with certain business objectives. Hence, you have an advertising and marketing budget to support them, and got just smarter on what were some of those dynamics, smarter on where we thought the market was going, and then decided let's reorient the business, not around a product, but around a positioning and a go-to-market strategy and a problem set. All that led us to what became just a more stable business, a more diversified business, more of a business than a couple, a handful of people kind of buying and selling as we have over this period of time. And it was really the beginning of like a company, which, still exists today. And I think those tenets that we created and instilled at that time is what has allowed the business, to be around for 20 plus years.
And again, it's funny because, if you look at some of the dynamics of the day, these things have come back around. What do these Fortune 500s want? They want access to premium inventory, right? So like good publishers, if they're thinking about not just, direct response, performance-based campaigns, they want to stand out. They want to be able to, drive a message home, right? So innovation in new ad formats, innovation in the technology, i.e. like rich media to deliver all that stuff. And all done in a way that, they wanted to transact, which at the time was still kind of pre-programmatic. So it laid the foundation for, again, with the business almost 20 years later, under new ownership, we're long gone, still has, I think, the core tenets of.
Yeah, I guess what you're talking about, as per Mike's point, is evolving from selling a very popular product to, selling a solution to a problem that is sort of timeless, right? And that has multiple dimensions. So
Exactly.
yeah, there might be a product that's particularly attractive, but there are other advantages like the premium supply and, other ad formats and so on.
It wasn't too long after that, you saw the birth of programmatic, right? The first DSP, the first ad exchange, the first SSP. You saw the birth of, kind of a data-driven approach to utilizing a lot of those tools, right? So the investment in like the third-party data platforms, so on and so forth. So, this was like kind of pre the programmatic wave, which again, looking back, timing couldn't have been better for us because as the industry kind of moved in one direction, we were developing this kind of unique, for at the time, very unique value proposition that was different where a lot of the ad tech industry, a lot of the ad tech rigmarole was moving in, which allowed us, I think, to have like real differentiation, a different message, a different voice, something that we can champion that was unique.
And when you say you were going against the grain amid the birth of programmatic, would that be that, the programmatic open market is coming into being and you're selling something that's more curated, being an ad network?
Yeah, exactly that. So the birth of the ad exchange created the birth of all sorts of inventory. A lot of it was, not like name brand premium inventory. So, we were able to, I think, be very responsive and nimble and creative in our go-to-market, which was like, yeah, cool, great. Like, absolutely, you should take advantage of all of these things. But when you want the association with like great inventory, when you want the controls, when you want all the quality, we would go to market with things like a brand safety guarantee, our own version of the, now is the, TD 500, the top 500 websites. partnerships with all the key rich media vendors. Like we were going in many cases, like zagging when the industry was zigging. And, to the extent that we would, say, no, we don't source any inventory on ad exchanges. It's only direct to publisher. Like we were, I think, like pretty contrarian on purpose because it allowed us to separate from the pack, but then also was aligned very much where we believed that, there was a real opportunity for brands to embrace digital in a different way.
Were there any specific competitors you guys were concerned about? Like sometimes you talk to entrepreneurs and they're like, yeah, there was this big company and they tried to buy us early or squash us or whatever. Did you guys have that or not really?
There were a lot of companies in our kind of broad competitive space, could be some point hundreds. There were with that though. There were really two that stood out. One was a company on the West Coast called Specific Media, which is rebranded a couple of times. I'm not sure what they're called today. Eric or Joe, you may know that.
Viant.
So Viant was a big competitor for a period of time. And then we had a company in New York. It was a little bit, they were West Coast, we were East Coast. So there were similarities, but also some differences, just as far as how we were running our companies, where our areas of focus were. So if you had like the circles, right, we'd have our circle and there would be like 30% overlap with their circle. But then, 70% of what they did and what we did was different enough that allowed for them to win and for us to win. I think a big thing to also understand when you're in a market is, are you an and or an or? And what that means specifically is this wasn't client usually buying just one. So you I think compete and you fight a little bit differently, right? The analogy is as follows. You're in the woods with 10 friends and a bear starts chasing you. You don't have to be first, you just can't be last. And that's a little bit of what it was like to compete at that point in time. And you wanted to be better than that. You don't want to be second to last because, maybe that bear is extra hungry or something happens. But we can compete and still we could both win effectively. And there was another company in New York called Collective Media. Our overlap was like 50% or 60%. And so that forced us to figure out, all right, well, how can we really hone in on the 30 or 40% that was different? Because now the majority of it was similar, but there were some differences. And even if there weren't differences, to survive, we had to paint a picture of difference. Otherwise, we commoditize. So I think, I'm more of a Coca-Cola drinker, so I would look at them as our Pepsi. And they probably looked at us as, whatever favorite soft drink they had, the opposite one. But I'm sure in a lot of ways it helped us. As I started a new business called M3, and right now we don't have a head-on competitor. And there's a positive to that because we're so new, but there's also a negative because then you don't get some of the benefit of what they're doing in market lifts the whole category. And so I think we probably benefited more than not by having a couple of those companies, and they were good companies doing what they were doing at the time.
Prior to, I think, the competitive field, whittling down and there being, I think, like a handful that were, kind of big and we were competing against all the time, there was this moment where there was a boom in ad network businesses. Basically like the early Lumascapes were just filled with these ad networks. And again, it created an interesting opportunity for us to be forward leaning and, number one, think about differentiation, but then number two, we were like early to the idea of like content marketing and thought leadership. So when there were hundreds of ad networks, one of the best things I think we ever did, Mike, I'm sure you'll agree, we put together this presentation. It was like called, I think, literally Ad Networks 101, where we would take this thing and do it at agencies, at brands. We would do it for 2 people, for 100 people during a time where increasingly a lot of spend was going in this direction, but there wasn't a lot of understanding of the different models and how to think about it and how to make decisions. So, we would just have it's relatively unbiased. We would have this presentation. We would walk through like, hey, here's, the entire universe. Here's, how they differentiate. Here's the questions you can ask. And, to me, that was one of, I think, the biggest, takeaways and lessons, which is, like being focused on, evangelizing and, educating around the category allows you to develop a leadership position in said category, which I think allowed us to get stronger. And then over time, be one of the handful remaining after programmatic and all that stuff, made a massive impact on the space.
If you think about the stages of growth, one way you might put it is, in the beginning, you guys have this agency advertising network. That's how you get to 3 million. Then you have this product that's sort of a, killer product. It's truly differentiated, and that allows you to achieve meaningful scale. And then you sort of get into the position where it's like, okay, now we need to be bigger than the product and we need to win on differentiation, marketing, and so on.
Yeah, I think that's right. This was during a time where I think we up-leveled and professionalized everything. So took on a private equity partner who helped us, think through how to get to the next level as it relates to like becoming more of a technology company, getting better at hiring the types of executives that can help us scale, build a proper marketing function, product function, so on and so forth. So yeah, around this time, we definitely took it to a much different level.
Yeah, well, let's dive into that a little bit. So, what parts of the business did you guys hold on to as you grew? And what were some of the like key initial hires you made to outsource critical functions in the company or to delegate critical functions?
Yeah, when I reflect back on the company, I think in the moment the company didn't feel like it had 2 or 3 stages. It felt like every year was almost a new stage because the market just moved so quickly. And so the products we were introducing, refinement of our positioning, what was hot. So it felt like it was a company you had to constantly kind of recreate yourself or keep innovating. And we try to keep certain core principles like premium and quality and so on and so forth. But having the benefit of hindsight, I look at the company as kind of in two phases. There's the pre-investment phase, to Eric's point of bringing on private equity, and what it was like then. Again, if I had like a white piece of paper, I would draw a circle, and what I would say is Eric and I were in the middle of it, and then we had our tentacles all around the circle, and the outside of the circle was sales, marketing, finance, technology, culture, strategy. Taking out the garbage. It was everything. And as founders, that's where we were. And then I think there's like an animation that flattens out the circle and then moves us from the middle to the top of it. And then underneath it, you start to have the creation of lines. And lines are functions, right? The function of finance, the function of marketing, the function of in the discipline. And then with that function, then you want leadership to lead those functions. And so that was really the genesis of us going from us and everything, running this more instinctually as entrepreneurs to trying to become managers, leaders, executives in a high growth private equity backed company in a market. And so with that, I think there was a real struggle of what do you own and what don't you own? And what do the playbook is raise money and go hire a bunch of great people. And that's a hard playbook to execute against. I actually think we were pretty good at that. I think the part of the playbook that's not in there, which was the hardest part, is what do you then do? So you hire these great people. What do you do? What do you then do? Because if they're so great, unfortunately, we had a lot of great people, then what's your job? And then redefining what your role is and what your purpose is as a founder and executive in a company. There's less literature and less guidance on what that is. And so I think that was something we had to figure out. But, we oriented towards the areas where we were both most comfortably suited and most effective. And there was a lot of it was commercial, market leadership, things like that. Eric talked about. Eric was always kind of like your jack of all trades. He could go in here to help with a problem and go in here to help with a problem, whether that was formal responsibility or informal. And then I tried to get a little bit tighter on strategy, culture, recruiting. And, that would change as the needs of the business and the growth, whether we had it or we didn't at the time. But that was probably a good way to think of how we oriented in this next phase, which was post-investment.
Did you guys like being managers, and did you still enjoy your role as much as the business grew? Because a lot of entrepreneurs like going 0 to 1 or maybe 1 to 10, but as the business gets bigger and becomes more and more of a, serious operation, they might not enjoy the managerial work as much.
I think that's right. It's also, I think, a little bit less for us, right? Because if you think about it, we started this business when we were very young. So nobody trained us, right? Like we didn't have, managers that we worked for a long time, like executives that we looked up to, can report to, can model. So it's a little bit of just trying to, figure out again, like what the job to be done is. I think over time we figured it out, got, a lot better and found those areas where we were, I think, uniquely suited to lead the company. And Mike captured it very well. Like, he was incredible on company culture, strategy, kind of pointing the ship in the right direction. Undertone became known as one of the best places to work and a very coveted place to get a job. 100% credit to Mike on that. And yeah, I think again, Joe, a lot of the stuff that we talk about on the pod, this idea of almost like the chief audience officer, being very market facing in a market where that can be a real advantage. I found I think my rhythm there again, we were predecessors to a lot of the strategies of today. I think that was very important in, the brand, finding the brand, having, the ecosystem sort of understand what it was all about. So I think we figured it out as we went along, but it was hard. And there was a lot of times where it was probably a long period of time where it was difficult before, again, this crystallized and became like what we do for the company.
I prefer the earlier, and that's why I've started another business, because I just think for me it's a creative outlet, right? Some people are into, they're bakers, they're chefs, they're artists, they're beekeepers, whatever it is. And for me, this is kind of like my creative outlet, like being involved in starting a company. It's a way for me to, there's a lot of components that are, whether it's, it's financial, this and that, but there's a lot of like creativity that comes with it. And I get a real, it gives me energy. And I think then it allows me to then push that energy out to others. And I think that's for me, I get a real volt from it. It was fun as the company scaled, but it also changed, and it was also different. And there were times where that was great as well. But there's something about being at the beginning stages of an idea. And in some cases, if the idea is timed well, you probably are wrong in the view of many people, because they haven't appreciated the idea or recognized the idea or seen the potential for it. And so then you have to have a certain level of vulnerability and armor to be able to fight through it, but then also learn where you are wrong, because you probably are, because it's so raw. And so I think that can be special. And again, that's why I signed up to do it again with this new company I'm through.
What did you guys learn about hiring, and specifically, what was the experience like of hiring a management team? Because I think when you're a young entrepreneur and you end up being successful and you can hire and need to hire serious people to help scale the operation, you're in an interesting position of usually having to hire people who might have like decades more experience than you do, which could be a tricky position for a founder. So I'm curious how you guys navigated that.
Yeah, one of the best parts of bringing in an outside investor was the knowledge that they gave us around this, and it was a classic. You don't know what you don't know until you do, and in some cases, it can be a little humbling. And I can reflect back to the first 7 or so years where it was Eric and I, and before we brought in outside capital, and what an interview would have looked like, and it's almost embarrassing to reflect back, right? I think of the lack of preparation I would have had as a manager. I'm sure I would sit behind a desk, and I can reflect sitting behind a desk, and it's whatever questions pop in my mind, and I'm probably judging you on, do I like you, and do I think it was randomness? And I'm sure the experience I gave candidates, I would probably, if I remembered them well enough, and if I saw them, I'd probably apologize, because I'm sure it sucked. Sure, it just wasn't that good. And so it was literally this change of like being just the worst at it, because the reality is you don't learn this in college, and you rarely learn it in the workplace. So all of a sudden you're asked to interview somebody either as a peer or you become a manager, and maybe somebody gives you a couple of minutes of guidance, and then that's kind of it. And then you're in a room and the door shuts, and figure it out. And the reality is most people never figure it out, and most people are awful at it. And so I was so positively influenced by the private equity group and the resources they put around us. There's a company called GH Smart. There's a book called Who. It's a really good read, and that's worthwhile for people to check out. The biggest change for me is I go into an interview now where I sell and I convince and I try to get you excited, and I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I'm trying to make you comfortable, and I want to get to know you, and I have much more of a scorecard and a criteria. And I'm a big believer in behavioral style interview. So instead of, what would you do? I want to hear, what did you do? Tell me a time when. And so my questions are pretty repetitive. And I tell a candidate when I start the interview, like, this is going to be it's going to sound like I'm asking you the same thing over and over again. Cause it's going to be, tell me a time when you dealt with a difficult worker. Tell me a time when you closed a challenging deal. Tell me a time when. And I just find I get so much more substance from that. It still means, the hiring's almost kind of like baseball, right? You hit 3 out of 10 and you're in the Hall of Fame. In this, it's, you want to be better than 3 out of 10. But the reality is you're probably going to fail 30, 40% of the time. But if you can fail 31 versus 39% of the time, I mean, the money you save, the time you save, it's a game changer. So I've got a lot of passion around that topic. And I give the private equity group, JMI, and the team of investors and the resources they brought to bear as being a big driver for my improvement. And I'm sure Eric and everybody else's.
Yeah, speaking of specific media and buy-in, I was actually hanging out with Tim and Chris a few weeks ago. We were all laughing about how in the beginning we were so bad at hiring, and we would just try to hire each other's employees, like literally hire people that used to work at a competitor because we thought that would be like the quickest path to a good hire, and those always were like some of the worst fits that you can imagine. And we all try to do it because there was no playbook for it. And yeah, to Mike's point, the transformation around like being good at hiring made all the difference. And I would argue put the company in the position where it ended up being to have a great outcome. We started getting prepared for interviews. And I'm getting very tactical, but I think it's worth talking about. Like we would develop a job spec. What is a job to be done? We would develop a candidate spec. The candidate for this type of job, what might they have done? Where did they work? What are they doing? We would spend time like looking at their background, like, depending on the nature of the hire. If it was an executive, we might do like hours of preparation going into the interview to, number one, develop the conviction around it. And then number two, have that type of conversation. So it went from being a source of weakness to an absolute source of strength for the business.
Yeah. And we would invest. I mean, I believe in hiring executive recruiters. It can be an expensive fee, but I just think it's worth it. So that's something we did, right? From a budget standpoint, we allocated the capital to pay, $50 to $75,000, $80,000 per hire times multiple hires. And so that was a big expense, but we thought it was going to put us in the best position to attract a candidate because we hired a real firm. We got that expertise. Yeah, you spend a lot of time. I would enter the year if we were hiring a CFO, I was going to put 100 hours into this. And so a first interview could be 2.5, 3 hours. And you might be doing 2 or 3 of them to follow up. So just realizing the importance of and the difference between a great hire versus a good one, is miles and miles of separation. And then what is the difference between a great one and a bad one? It's, it's from like here to the moon. And they can make such a difference.
Who were some of those transformational hires when you were looking to grow? Who made a big impact and what made them great?
I can look back at all the senior people we hired, and honestly, there was learnings and benefits from all of them. Some of them stuck around for years and years, and some stuck around for a couple months, whether they're of their choosing or ours, right? And so I think there was a mix of benefit. I think the ones that probably helped us the most, without giving specific names, were the ones who also just brought business acumen and business sense and good business judgment to the table. Because I think that's something what Eric and I needed more of. Meaning we were really deep, but we weren't as wide, and our experience was very much focused on about.com, which was a short-lived experience, and then what we were doing. And so I was always yearning for, what did another company do? Like, what was the decision making like at X and at Y and at Z? And the people who could bring that to bear instantly were just super attractive to us as candidates and added a ton of value. So I feel like there was that. Then the best ones were the ones who realized they were part of a team, and the ones who realized, well, you might own a function. Ultimately, it's like rowing the boat, right? And you're the rower, if you will, for marketing or tech. But ultimately, it doesn't matter if you're the fastest. If everybody else isn't in sync, that boat's wobbling and ain't going in the best direction. And so getting the people that realized it was team first and then function second, I think were really, really important. And then obviously there had to be culture fit and all those sort of things. So yeah, so we lucked out and we got it more right than wrong, which is what recruiting is. It's literally getting it more right than wrong, and then making sure when you get it wrong, you don't realize it on day 400. You realize it on day 40, and then you do something about it. And that's the hard part, and that's the biggest thing that all of us need to do, especially in our early stage.
A head of sales who brought a level of like discipline around sales operations, revenue operations to a business that was just like winging it, right, and grew organically. A COO who led like both product and technology and marketing functions at a big business, who was very good at M&A because we wanted to do more M&A, right? So like the things that nobody needed to teach us ad tech. Nobody needed to teach us like ad serving and like creative and everything like that. But like people that just brought like new, fresh, orthogonal business experience to a company that grew organically, was $100 million business and needed to transform constantly. I think as I think about the best hires and the ones that help us scale, it was people that brought, like things that we didn't have.
Yeah. So I love the point about when you're making executive hires to try to scale, finding people who can provide context that you don't have, and then who are also complementary. I think this is like a point people will make about diversity, right? And I mean, many different kinds of diversity. Like we all tend to gravitate toward people who are like us. I know in marketing, if I'm on like an agency team, I'm going to gravitate toward the people who are like ideas people, right? And who maybe are great writers and that, because that's like the type of intelligence that's most legible to me, when really that's the part I do. So I need the people who are like Energizer bunnies and who like have the relationships with journalists and like will find out all the events and like all that type of stuff. So yeah, that resonates with me. Okay, so you evolve beyond the initial product. You're scaling ad network, you're hiring a team. Where do you sort of get to with that? And how do you get to the point where you're considering an acquisition? Were you considering an acquisition, or did Perion sort of approach you? How did that all come together?
We had gone through prior sales processes with investment banks where we were led into two of them. There was one that happened led by a company that wanted to, I think it was a private equity group that wanted to make another investment. And we realized, we should do a little bit of a market check and hire a bank to help us and get the best guidance, and then also have other conversations. And then through that process, we had some options, but ultimately didn't transact. And so that was, all right, well, let's learn from that. Let's learn where some of our gaps were in the business, because there were a lot of positives to the company, but there were also a couple of things that buyers saw that either they just weren't comfortable with, or the risk profile was too great to justify the price that we were seeking. And so we had to take that feedback, just like anything, and try to be better. And so that was something that we worked on for call it the next 2 years. And then we entered another sale process, and kind of a similar situation where a ton of progress in the business. And then you plug a few gaps or areas for improvement, and then you find the next crop. But then with that, the company is scaled. So then also our expectations of value were a lot higher than where they were prior. And so we could have easily gotten the value from call it the 2 years, but that wasn't where we thought the business was. And so that process ended up concluding without a transaction. And then, maybe about a year to 18 months later, over that period of time, we were approached by Perion, and there's enough merit of their offer. There's no strategic fit. Timing had made sense, partially because we had gone through this before, and we realized that I don't think as a business, we had the energy to go through it again. And so at that point, we weren't maximizing for value as much as we had prior. And so we still had a, value orientation towards what we were expecting. But we also were probably more focused on certainty to close and certainty to get something done. And that led us to ultimately transact and close on that.
Yeah, it was good timing. And basically a company, Perion, was at the time, they were looking for a transformational acquisition because their core business was like this like search distribution business, which was great, very, very profitable. But, it was a public company, and they wanted to make a statement. So they were looking for a company that had a fairly unique profile. Like if you were to look at the whole Lumascape and start to whittle it down based on the characteristics that Perion was looking for, you very quickly whittle down the Lumascape to just a handful of players. And that was, a business with like real revenue, real profit, real EBITDA. So basically that's, cuts out the whole Lumascape, right? But I'm not, sort of only partially kidding, right? Like one of the things that I'm very proud of us for over the years. Like we were always like a profitable business and like a great financial profile. So it's like number one, great financial profile. Number two, a known brand in the marketplace. At the time, Undertone, this was 2015, it was a 15-year-old company that had a strong brand, that had strong brand awareness. And then number three, great customers. And again, to this day, if you go to the Undertone website, you look at the customers, it's the best of the best. It's always the Fortune 500s. So if you start to like overlay again the Lumascape and use some of those characteristics, there weren't too many companies that fit that bill. And, for the right buyer who valued that type of asset, we were like probably one of the maybe 2 or 3 choices in the market. And it was good timing for us.
Would you do it again?
Yes, do it again. Just if it was a force, yes or no. I think what's interesting is if we didn't sell, I think it would have been a more challenging couple of years following that. But then I think we would have come out of that, and with where the market then kind of took the next step, and then we would have been a much more scaled business. And so I think it's a lot of, it's a point in time, right? And so at that point in time, for me, there was a couple of considerations. One is as a shareholder, One is says that I was a CEO at the time, and then or just prior, and then just personally, like what did I want? So you have three lenses basically, right? Three people you're trying to satisfy, or three sets of people you're trying to satisfy, sometimes individual, sometimes groups. And I knew personally also I was ready for a change. I noticed that the market had evolved a lot. So programmatic was starting to really get going. And at that time, it seemed like the buyer was more focused on how do I buy than what am I buying? And it seemed like all that was the orientation was, as long as it's easy to buy, I don't care if it's crappy. I just want to buy it. And that was a very different story than what we had. And it felt like that was going to take some time for that story to come back and in vogue, which effectively it has. But yeah, looking back at the decision then, I don't sit here and ever regret it.
Yeah, same. I mean, it's so rare to build a business of that size and be profitable consistently. It's rare to have that type of outcome. It was public knowledge, a $180 million acquisition. So, like hindsight being 2020, of course, if we, knew exactly what was going to happen in the world, made the right decisions, hung on for a few years, at the end of it, we probably could have had an outcome 2 or 3x that time, but that would have been another 5 years of grinding it out. Right. And I think, like on a personal level, there was more things that I wanted to do. So spending another 5 years, like being all in on Undertone would have prevented that. And we probably wouldn't have been having this conversation, right? You and I, Joe, doing what we're doing, having the venture fund. Mike, he went on to do another business in the middle of Undertone and M3. So, again, hindsight is always 2020. I think we could have held on, had a much bigger outcome, but that's time, right? And yeah, we probably could have done a couple of things along the way to optimize that outcome or successive outcomes. But again, like it was such a great experience, a great ride, a great outcome that you can't have any regrets.
Yeah, and you don't want to sell at the point where you're like sick of it, right? I mean, you guys had been doing it for a long time, and it wasn't obviously, I imagine, a life-changing outcome personally for both of you. So that makes sense. Is there anything you would do differently, either when you think about growing the company or selling it? Is there anything top of mind there?
I'll go first on this one, right? It's like, maybe sort of there's the micro and the macro in some ways. So, again, this was such a good outcome and such a good story that, I wouldn't change anything in retrospect. One thing I think we personally, Mike and I could have done better with is, we were always heads down, focused on the next deal, then the next quarter, then the next year. And I think we built a great culture of recognizing, great people and achievements and everything like that. We never celebrated success, or maybe like very rarely, we would do it. Right. So I think, kind of stopping to smell the flowers along the way, I think would have been a good thing. But again, kind of no regrets, on something related to, the outcome. Undertone was like this really incredible company with a lot of great assets. And I think along the way, we may have had a different outcome if we would have been, I think, very purposeful on, developing top to top relationships with who could have been maybe the strategic acquirers of the business along the way to make sure they knew about the business and not know about us from like, again, back to our pod, like what Undertone was 10 years ago when they might have worked with us, when they were a director at some other company, right? So, I think like, some of the kind of key relationships, fostering them over time might have led to a different or equal or bigger outcome, but you never know. Those are the two things that come to mind that I think, but I might have done differently. What about you, Mike?
Yeah, those are two right ones, especially from a business standpoint. On the one that Eric said is spending time knowing who your buyer might be from an M&A standpoint. Ultimately and ideally, you want your company to be acquired versus sold. It's just a very different outcome. It's a very different dynamic in a sale process. And so if you can foster that, we met a lot of companies when we did hire investment banks that liked the story, liked what we were doing. But to ask that person that you're meeting for the first time to then go in front of their board and get a couple $100 million check, it's a big ask. But if we met that company and that person 18 months ago and maybe did a little bit of a test together or had some time together, it's just a very different conversation. So that was a big learning. And then, two things that come to mind, I see it a lot as I'm in business groups and talk to different folks that are in their, entrepreneurial management journey. And I think the first is M&A is so overrated as far as making acquisitions yourself. And so I think so many companies get it wrong, right? You start a company, you gain some scale, maybe you bring in some capital, and then what do? It's like a pretty consistent playbook. You hire a senior team, you introduce more products, you want to sell more to your base, and then you're going to go buy a bunch of stuff. And that buy a bunch of stuff makes you feel like you're, a conqueror. And there's a real ego, I think, that comes with it. Like, I'm going to buy another company. Like that's a cool thing to say I did and to do. And you just shouldn't do it. And so I think we made mistakes on M&A. And I think in some cases, the mistake was also what M&A we did. And then who had a voice at the table for the company or the category we can pursue. And I can think about businesses that I wanted to buy that we should have bought, but I think I let groupthink muddy the water. And so that's a big takeaway. And then the second thing, which is kind of an offshoot of that, is, a lot of American companies also think we're going to go to Europe, like we're going to expand internationally. Don't do it. The US is so big. Europe is so hard, so complicated. Other than being in Europe is a wonderful thing because it's just a great place to spend time and travel, and it's exciting. Doing business in Europe, in any foreign country, it's hard. And the market opportunity in each of them, because Europe is not the United States, Europe is a collection of lots of countries, it's just not worth it. So those are like the big macro things that I've, assessed as, if there was a do-over, those would be ones I would seriously reconsider.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mike, question for you. So Joe asked, what would you do different if you can do it again or turn back time? With M3, you're kind of doing it again. And we don't have the time. Maybe we'll have you back to talk about, M3 and what you're doing. But, you're building a business with Undertone-like characteristics. So you have a chance to actually do some of this stuff again. And it's a very different stage, but are you applying any of the Undertone learnings to M3 with the way you're doing it now? Again, granted, at a very early stage.
Yeah, we're super early at M3. Effectively, what we're doing is it's adjacent to retail media, but also very different at the same time. We're going to retailers that don't have a media offering and creating one for them, and then going to the advertisers with an opportunity to reach customers in these really cool shopping, first to market, unique inventory environments. And so it's a premium, quality, differentiated sort of sell, which really is what we did at Undertone. So I think the things they're similar, like Eric, I have a great partner. His name's Greg Stellato. So to have somebody that I like working with, that I trust, that's in this with me, is a different person, but a repeat, and having someone you have a good rapport with and you have confidence in. So I think that's the thing that's most similar at this early stage, is the dynamic of not doing it alone. Because it's harder to do it alone. And frankly, it's less fun to do it alone. And then there's a lot of trying to make sure we don't, which we did at Undertone, is I don't think we chase the shiny object, and here we're not chasing the shiny object. So saying no to things that are wrong for us, and even though that may delay some market adoption and delay some revenue recognition, it feels like the right thing to do. But then once we scale, because I have a lot of confidence that we will, I'm sure there'll be a big reflection, right, on what worked and what didn't, and how times change, and how are there also parallels to just building a business, whatever day and age you do it.
Yeah, that's great. And Mike gave us a couple extra episode ideas, Eric, which are the M&A episode, Terry Kawaja, This Is Your Moment, and the expanding internationally episode. And maybe we can have someone who can, make both sides of that argument, though. It's funny, Mike, I just saw a tweet yesterday that I sent a friend that was like, it was about, French regulators, I think, suing NVIDIA. And it was like, what if Europe built some of their own tech companies instead of just suing ours? So, your point is well taken. Guys, this was amazing.
Pleasure spending time with you. And Eric, as always, it was fun to chat. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. It was fun recounting it. Nothing more to hit outside of thank you for not embarrassing me along the way, Joe, by forcing Mike to answer anything.
For sure. And if you listen to this for like 75 minutes or whatever this was, please smash that subscribe button, guys. Like, I'm doing fine. You guys know that, but Eric's really hungry for these subscribes. He needs these listens, okay? So
it helps the podcast grow. It helps us get great guests like Mike. It helps us bring this to you at no cost every week. So please do smash that like button. And with that, I think we're out. See you guys. See you, everybody.
bye-bye.